having access to the decision makers, and getting more and more First Nations people within all federal government parties.
Tonight, with an election on the horizon, federal opposition leaders deliver campaign-style speeches at the Chiefs' Assembly.
It also supports the healing, which courts cannot award.
Day school students could soon receive some compensation for their treatment under Canada's assimilation regime.
We would like, the Métis Nation to form more awareness of what's happening out there.
And the Métis Nation of Alberta wants to hear from their people about the effects of climate change. Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. It was the Prime Minister's turn at the Assembly of First Nations Tuesday. Today, the Chiefs heard from the leaders of Canada's opposition parties. Here's what they had to say, or in the case of one leader, didn't have to say. Tom Fenario reports from Gatineau.
With the next federal election less than a year away, APTN National Chief Perry Bellegarde gave opposition party leaders a warning. Ignore First Nation voters at your own peril.
When we looked at the October 2015 results, First Nations voters influenced 51 ridings.
Leader of the Green Party, Elizabeth May, was the first to address the Chiefs. Rather than make big promises on policy, May offered to make the Green Party an ally.
I can't say that I'm going to be in the national leaders debates as a voice for you because you are your own voice. But I want you to put the words in my mouth. I want you to tell me what needs to be said.
NDP leader Jagmeet Singh put an emphasis on bills that the NDP have pushed forward in the interest of Indigenous rights. He also made a pitch to the audience, saying that the NDP will move quicker than other parties when it comes to the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
I believe we can do better, and we need to do better. And partial measures and half steps are not enough. They're not adequate. They're not sufficient, given the seriousness of the situation.
Conservative Party leader Andrew Scheer spoke last. He broached the subject of improving education and job skills training as a way to narrow the wealth gap between First Nations and non-Indigenous people.
Our next Conservative government will be ready to work with you to overcome these challenges. Our goal should be to build long-term prosperity, not simply managing poverty.
But when asked how his policies would be different from Stephen Harper's, Scheer's response didn't win many friends.
I'm going to have to ask you to have a little bit of patience for when our platform gets released. You'll see some very clear demarcations for where we will be different. But we've already, no.
At the end, Bellegarde thanked all the leaders who spoke. He also called on First Nations people to push Indigenous issues to the front of the upcoming federal election campaign.
But it's all about accessibility, having access to the decision makers, and getting more and more First Nations people within all federal government parties, no question.
Tom Fenario, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Dozens of supporters and residents of Grassy Narrows First Nation were on Parliament Hill today. They're calling on the federal government to compensate the community for the ongoing mercury crisis. The community has been dealing with the effects of mercury poisoning for nearly half a century after a nearby pulp mill dumped contaminants in the English Wabigoon River system. Ontario committed $85 million to clean up the river, while the federal government has committed to funding a treatment centre. But the community thinks Canada should play a bigger role.
The federal government have tried to wash their hands and saying it's not our problem, but it is their problem. Because this is Canada, this is their country, and they have an obligation to a fiduciary obligation to the First Nations of Canada. They can't just try to wash their hands clean and say this is not our problem. It is their problem, and we want to hold them accountable. And it's time that they take responsibility.
The mercury crisis also made its way into the House of Commons as NDP MP Charlie Angus asked the government about it during question period.
The term need for urgent action, what does that mean when talking about children at Grassy Narrows with seizures, physical impairments, hearing and sight loss, children who can't remember basic math questions because they've been poisoned, and yet the community continues to struggle with underfunded education, shortages of special ed, unable to hire qualified teachers, and an outstanding need for a full assessment for every single child. Will the minister agree that urgency means action now and end the underfunded education at Grassy Narrows and insist on a full assessment for every single child in that community?
Minister of Indigenous Services.
Mr. Speaker, urgency means action now, and it means actions we've already taken. We have made sure that there are special education funds for all students in that community, and I've already shown the member the numbers in terms of how much we have invested in special education in that community. I have already made a commitment to that community the first time I met with the previous chief to say that we will go forward with the new health facility. We've now received the feasibility plan. I met with the new chief this week, and we are moving forward on a new health centre.
We're always looking to hear what you have to say. Here's how to continue the conversation. Send your emails to news@aptn.ca. Find us online at aptnnews.ca and on youtube.com/aptn news. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram for the latest Indigenous news. An agreement in principle has been reached between Ottawa and former Indian Day School survivors. Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett made the announcement Thursday. Flanked by former students, Gary McLean attended the Dog Creek Indian Day School in Manitoba. McLean filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of an estimated 200,000 survivors. Day school survivors were left out of the Indian residential school settlement agreement because they were allowed to go home at night. Details of the settlement are expected to be released next year.
While the agreement in principle includes individual compensation for harms associated with attendance at the Indian Day schools, it also supports the healing, which courts cannot award. We are investing $200 million to support healing, wellness, education, language, culture, and commemoration for all those affected by Indian Day schools.
To me, the feeling, it's hard to explain a feeling because there's so much emotion in it. But I do know it's happening. This moment is happening, and I do know it will help thousands of our people to have the same feeling I'm having to get to the next level.
Dr. Lynn Lavallee was hired by the University of Manitoba to bring in more Indigenous students and professors. Now the U of M's Vice Provost of Indigenous Engagement is calling it quits. Ashley Branson has more on that story.
Dr. Lynn Lavallee was hired in September 2017. Now, just over a year later, she's quitting. She says the administration at the University of Manitoba is not doing enough to combat systemic racism against Indigenous peoples.
I think that we have to look beyond the structures in the academy. So if there's a complaint about racism or harassment, it's a complaint-driven process at any institution. And as soon as you go through that complaint-driven process, it becomes silenced. Confidentiality steps in, and we isolate someone.
She says that isolation can be so bad, many Indigenous students are afraid to come forward. In an email statement to APTN, the university says they will keep trying to work together with Indigenous peoples. Fulfilling the strategic plan commitments can be challenging, just as implementing the action items outlined in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission will not always be easy for this nation, but resolving to persist in this pursuit is critically important.
We have to acknowledge that these are colonial institutions, and that's what we're up against.
Lavallee says this issue isn't isolated. It's happening in post-secondary institutions across Canada. Something needs to change.
We recognize that these are colonial institutions that are full of bureaucracy, but we can make change. We can make change at Board of Governors and Senate. I've made policy changes at Senate, at other institutions. It can happen, and it can happen quickly if you have the motivation and if you have the will and if you have the right people at the table. It can happen.
Dr. LaValle leaves the U of M December 31st. She steps into her new role as an advisor to the Dean of Community Services at Toronto's Ryerson University in the new year. Ashley Branson, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
The Thunder Bay Police Association has finally weighed in on a widely circulated video that appears to show one of its officers striking an underage girl. That and much more still to come.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamoran, and here's what's coming up on Nation to Nation. We're coming to you from the floor of the Assembly of First Nations Chiefs Assembly. Indigenous Services Minister Jane Philpott announced sweeping reforms to child welfare. We'll have a full interview with her on what this means. As well, APTN National Chief Perry Bellegarde tells me what work is left to do as we head into the final year of the Trudeau government's mandate. And we'll hear from Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett on settlements with residential day schools and day scholars. That's right after the national news.
Here's a look at Friday's weather forecast starting on the East Coast. +2 and snow for Halifax. Snow and -1 in Charlottetown. -12 with flurries for Happy Valley Goose Bay. -8 in Nain. 6 below for Montreal with snow. 19 below in Chibougamau. -4 in Toronto. Sunny and -8 in Ottawa. -11 for Thunder Bay. 18 below under sunny skies in Kapuskasing. -16 in Churchill. 14 below in Pucketawagan, -11 in the Paw, 10 below for Norway House, -12 and sunny for Winnipeg and Gimli, -9 in Brandon, in Saskatchewan, -8 in North Battleford, Saskatoon and Swift Current, -11 in Uranium City, -7 in La Ronge. Welcome back. The president of Thunder Bay's Police Association says the video that appears to show an officer striking and holding down a youth on a gurney is not an isolated event. Greg Stevenson said in an email statement that officers are struggling to meet the demands of policing in the city. Stevenson said they're deeply offended by the reaction of First Nations leaders to the incident. The officer in the video, who has not been identified, is being investigated internally by Thunder Bay Police's Professional Standards Branch. Stevenson said he's confident the officer will be vindicated. That officer is currently on leave getting medical treatment for exposure to bodily fluids. Toronto-based lawyer Julian Faulkner said the officer should have been suspended.
What I find unique to Thunder Bay, and a never-ending theme, is that while the chief of police talks about unacceptable behavior and her great concern over the actions that we all witness on the video, how can it be that this police officer who slaps a youth on a gurney is not under suspension? It is completely within the realm of the chief of police and this police services board to have suspended the police officer pending the investigation. That's how it's done. Why is it different in Thunder Bay?
57 people from the Blood Tribe in southern Alberta had an overdose in the month of November. The problem with drugs and overdoses seems to be deepening every month. Community leaders say they are prepared and dealing with the crisis, but a local doctor says they've been spending so much time saving lives, they haven't been able to deal with the biggest fallout around them, the impact on the children. Tamara Pimentel reports.
Lori Eagleplume visits the Blood Tribe Department of Health regularly for her Suboxone treatment. She's been clean from her fentanyl addiction for almost 4 years. Her motivation? The thought of her children being released into the foster care system.
Them almost getting taken away from me, it was hard knowing that either you get help today or if you don't, we're gonna go take your kids. And I was just like, thought about my kids and I was like, no. Okay, I'm gonna get help, I'm gonna do it for them.
Eagleplume got help in time, but Dr. Esther Tailfeathers says parents losing their kids because of drug use is an all too common story in the community. She believes the continuous rise of overdoses on the reserve has made the overall safety and security for youth less of a priority.
There's not a huge safety net for them. We're so busy concentrating on saving the lives of the people who are addicted that we're not watching the fallout around them, and the youth are absorbing a lot of the grief. We're seeing more and more youth becoming addicted. We had a 13-year-old that overdosed in front of our tribal office a week ago.
In November, the Blood Tribe was hit with 57 overdoses and 4 deaths. The worst month this year.
It feels like we're living in the city with the sirens, you know. We're never used to be like that, you know, and when you hear the sirens and you just know what it is.
Tailfeather says the community has taken major steps to save people from overdoses. Emergency Health Services has increased the amount of ambulances and team members, and the Blood Tribe Police have more officers. But while lives are being saved, families have lost their housing to addictions. Children are becoming homeless. They're hungry because they aren't getting the nutrition they need, and many aren't attending school. And Tailfeather says 39% of babies from the Blood Tribe are born into neonatal abstinence.
Usually those babies are not released to the mother. They are released either to a family member who becomes a temporary guardian, or they're released into the foster care system. So right from birth, the babies are sent into foster care, and it's so sad to see that. And that's one part of our population that we really haven't been paying attention to, that we really do need to be concerned with.
The overdoses have impacted the economy as well.
It would be so nice if we could be spending all that money that we're spending on saving lives, if we could spend it at the other end and make this a really nice place to be, and actually really dealing with the trauma issues that we need to deal with, but we're not getting there.
Eagleplume says she encourages others struggling with addictions to seek help.
Coming off drugs was one of the best things because, you know, I got my family back, you know. I got my home. It was one of the best things I ever did.
Tamara Pimentel, APTN National News on the Blood Reserve.
A BC mega project with the backing of the Squamish Nation still has some critics. That story is still to come. Here's the rest of Friday's weather forecast, picking back up in northern Alberta. Sunny skies and -6 for Fort McMurray, -11 in Peace River. 0 for Calgary, -2 and sunny in Lethbridge. 8 above for Tofino, showers and +4 in Victoria and Vancouver. -7 in Smithers, -9 in Prince George. 13 below for Fort Nelson. -14 in Old Crow, sunny, and -18 for Watson Lake. -12 in Norman Wells, -9 in sunny skies for Yellowknife. -16 in Inuvik, -13 for Colville Lake. -23 in Baker Lake, -28 and snow for Whale Cove, 30 below in Chesterfield. -26 in Joe Haven, 29 below in Igloolik. Welcome back. In British Columbia, a natural gas mega project has just been given the green light with the backing of the Squamish Nation. But as APTN's Tina House reports, the decision to approve the project is a controversial one, and not everyone supports the decision to go ahead.
Here in picturesque Howe Sound, just 40 kilometers away from downtown Vancouver, is the former site of the wood fiber pulp mill, which closed in 1958. Now, thanks in part to an 8-6 vote by the Squamish Nation Council, it will be the new home of the $1.6 billion wood fiber LNG project.
The Squamish Nation has signed on to the impact benefit agreements to allow the project to proceed from the Squamish Nation's perspective, the council's perspective.
And those impact benefit agreements will add up to $1.8 billion in cash and contracts for the nation. It's taken the Squamish Nation 5 years to reach a decision, and for the first time in their history, complete an environmental and cultural assessment of a major industrialized project like this within their traditional territory. The company building it agreed to 25 conditions, such as land management and the recognition of the ancient Squamish village of Sweeyacht, as well as enacting an environmental management program. The conditions also included water management and underwater noise monitoring studies, as well as the agreement for the company to only ship liquefied natural gas and not oil or bitumen.
Like many projects in Canada, there can be challenging for First Nations, but this is a decision that the Council has made and is really looking forward to moving into the next steps of implementing this, hopefully to the satisfaction of our people and our future generations.
Squamish Nation member Charlene Williams strongly disagrees with the project.
I think it's really disheartening that our leadership was able to make this decision without bringing it to referendum, without having the voice of the people being heard.
Williams says that over the years, the pollution in the water from the former pulp mill and other industries devastated their way of life in the Howe Sound, and it's now just starting to rejuvenate.
Of course, having big tankers coming through, that's not good for the sea life, especially for whales and porpoises that are just returning. The noise pollution, there's just so many different cumulative impacts that can arise from a project such as this.
Tankers will now carry LNG to Asian markets twice a week once the project is completed. Tina House, APTN National News, Squamish.
The Métis Nation of Alberta are holding sessions across the province to learn more about how climate change is affecting Métis people. APTN's Chris Stewart was at their latest session in Edmonton and has more.
The Métis Nation of Alberta is taking climate change seriously. The organization is modernizing many of their offices, making them more energy efficient. And their new cultural gathering center in Métis Crossing will be using renewable energy. But they want to hear from people across the province and to get first-hand accounts of how climate change is impacting them. Andreas Verlea is the manager of climate leadership for the MNA.
We've heard many things. So they vary from climate change affects, harvesting. It affects, we can't find medicinal plants. We would like the Métis Nation to form more awareness of what's happening out there. So it's been very varied. At the same time, lots of opportunities too. We would like to see community members involved, for example, in the monitoring of these things and making sure that the Métis way of life is protected.
It was a small turnout in Edmonton, but Jordan Reeves thinks it's important to be here. He's a hunter, gatherer, and trapper, and says he believes animal migrations are being changed by climate change. He also thinks the quality of water is in peril. He has noticed the changes in the past decade.
I have seen a difference, and when it comes to water quality, big difference, and like a big problem here around the central Edmonton area, just because of the development and how many people there are in the area. Is a high population, and the lakes that are so close. So the impact on our waters are a huge thing.
The MNA told people at the session that they want them to monitor and report when they see issues caused by climate change. The MNA will take the information and construct a climate management plan.
We want a lot of passionate feedback. We're open to hearing from everyone, all different types of opinions, and that's why we're going all across the province to all the different regions, because each region is going to be a bit unique in the different impacts that are important.
More sessions will be held in Peace River and Grand Prairie in January. Chris Stewart, APTN National News, Edmonton.
That's your APTN National News for this Thursday. For news anytime, visit our website, aptnnews.ca, or download the APTN News app. Nation to Nation with Todd Lamoran's next, and with the AFN Assembly going on, it's going to be a good one. I'm Dennis Ward. Have a great night.
Tonight on Nation to Nation, we're at the AFN Special Chiefs Assembly in Ottawa. A hot topic is new Indigenous child welfare legislation, as there's a lot on the line.
I believe getting it right on this will save lives.
But it's not the only piece of legislation coming up. The Indigenous Languages Act is also expected next month.
I'm going to push the members of Parliament and Cabinet to get it done, passed through that House.
And there's a settlement for residential school survivors, but it's not for day scholars.
There is a sense of
legislation. The feds want to hand over authority of Indigenous child welfare to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And the hope is that this will save lives by keeping children at home. There's a lot more to do. That's why I'm here, joined by Minister Philpott. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you for having me.
Now, of course, the APTN News broke this last week about this new child welfare legislation. But what does that mean when we're talking about handing over power to Indigenous people?
Well, as you know, this is something that we've been hearing from for decades, really. One of the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, call to action number 4, said there should be federal legislation, and it should establish national principles around child and family services, but also that it should affirm the rights of First Nations to exercise the